going to try and do three things, really. I'm going to say a bit about context, what we do in Europe, and some of the research. I'm going to try and put that into how it sees how the European work contributes to the international findings. And I'll be speaking very much from an evidence review we did, our Insights publication, which I think is available here. And I'm going to say a little bit about what I see as some of the possible or potential new challenges, things on the horizon that might cause us problems. Well, let's start with a question, and it's a very easy one, depending on what system you like to work in. What do these numbers have in common? And well, the answer is that they're all legal maximum speed limits in the EU. And the point I'm trying to make is that we have very limited harmonisation in the road safety area in Europe. And there's a really easy reason why that's the case. And that's because we have very limited legal competence at the EU level. So it's a subsidiarity issue. It's for member states to decide. It's problematic for our citizens. If you look at that map, today many people will drive across one or two national borders in their daily life. But where we do, I guess, have some debate in terms of impaired driving, it's been very much on alcohol. But even after a very long time, we haven't reached agreement there yet, although maybe things are changing. So if we look at the current state of play, member states act differently, and that comes to their approach, to their legal frameworks, to their testing, the priority they give the issue. And also, I think we have to bear this in mind, there's very different national contexts in terms of background drug use, and that also affects how the issue is seen. And but slowly the recognition of this issue is gaining ground, probably, I would say, from an EU perspective. I wouldn't overstate it. So let's just have a little look at what does that mean in practice. And this is what happens in terms of different approaches to impairment or per se or zero tolerance laws, and what we see is there's lots of differences. If we look at detection limits, those countries that have them and the fluids they test for, we see, well, some commonality, but again, quite a lot of differences. And if we look at the ability to police to take saliva samples at the roadside at police control, again, we see a lot of differences. Some countries not using it at all. Most countries can do urine, police can do urine testing, but again, the circumstances, how that's done, vary considerably. And if you look at the sanctions, they really, well, are very, very different. And I have to say, against this background, is my impression, although it's not documented, the relative risk of being detected across countries varies considerably, and is probably not associated with the severity of sanctions, but I say it more on belief, supposition, rather than evidence. So what does that mean in terms of activities at the EU level? Well, there's not a lot at the moment. There's no routine monitoring drugs and driving. At my agency, we're responsible for looking at all aspects of the drug situation in Europe. We try and follow the topic, but mainly through looking at legal developments and studies. We've contributed to this meeting. We've had a number of publications in this area, in which our Insights evidence review is the most recent. The good news is reducing drugs and driving is an objective in the EU Action Plan. The bad news is there are many, many objectives in the EU Action Plan. Few topics aren't. But if we go back to really look at what the evidence in Europe, I think we have seen some traction there, and it all goes back to 2003 with the Road Safety Action Programme, and that was on the legal basis of looking at common driving licences across the EU. And it was noted at that time that we knew a bit, we reckon about a quarter of our fatalities on the road were related to alcohol, but nobody knew anything about drug driving. And the Druid programme was set up to try and use comparable methodology, and I think that's a key point to look at this issue across Europe. So it was quite a big project, about 20 million euros in all, 7 work packages, 5 years work, 18 countries, and 50 reports in all sorts of areas. And I think standing back from it, one of the conclusions you can also draw that even when you spend quite a lot of money, this project demonstrates this is a very complex and challenging area for research, even when it is well resourced. So let's just have a look at some of those results and see what they say. Well, one of the study packages looks at drivers who'd been killed or injured, and what we see there is quite a big studies, and again, comparable methodology. Positivity ranges between 26 and 57% for both injured and mortality. Alcohol was massively the drug most frequently detected, 19 to 45% of in countries. in 90% of cases, and often at very high doses. So 70% of the killed drivers had alcohol levels which suggested severe impairment. The presence of illicit drugs varied considerably, but was generally quite low in this exercise. And when it was detected, it was often detected in combination with alcohol. So that's the sort of fatalities and injury work. What happens when we look at attempt to do a robust roadside testing study? This is using common parameters, same methodologies, different time periods, 50,000 drivers, 13 countries. What we see overall, the study found that just about 7.5% had some psychoactive substance on board. 3.5% of that was for alcohol. At the 0.1 level. But when we look at drugs, we see just under 2% positive, but when we look at the range across countries, but both between substances and between countries, there was huge variation in the findings. Slightly less in terms of the medicinal groups looked at, 1.4%. And if we look at combinations, both for alcohol with drugs or medicines, or combination of drugs and medicines, it was about 0.4 for both of those groups. So what can we conclude from that? Was the interesting thing, and echoing, I think, what we've already heard this morning, the highest prevalence, there was regional differences and national differences. The highest prevalences were found for alcohol, most frequently in southern European countries and Belgium for reasons that are complex. There was also more drug driving in southern European countries, and to some extent Western European countries. Greater use of medicinal products in northern countries, and lower rates across the board in eastern parts of Europe. Druid tried to do something quite challenging, and they tried to crunch both the experimental and the prevalence data together and come up with some sort of relative risk scores. And they came up with this model across a scale going from slightly increasing risk, relative risks between 1 and 3, up to extremely high risk. And what they found both alcohol at the legal level in most countries and cannabis at 0.5 level were slightly increased risk. But by the time you get up to both amphetamines and multiple drugs, much higher increased risks, at 5 to 30% relative risk factors, and extremely high risks for alcohol in combination with drugs and alcohol at high levels. It must be said you have to be extremely careful at looking at this analysis, especially for THC and amphetamines, simply because of the inter-country variation and the difficulty is crunching the statistics. Another interesting fact is that when we look at the testing in terms of what's happening at the roadside, it's not directly associated to background drug prevalence. And I think that's interesting because it suggests there's different factors at play. It's not just how much drug use there is in the country that reflects how much drug use is being used on the roads. So little relation with countries between general population prevalence rates. Tried to put Druid into the comparison, what it adds to the international data. And this is based on published and reviewed studies. So in terms of roadside surveys, I think overall you typically tend to find rates of 2 to 7% positive for any psychoactive substances, but you find higher prevalence if urine's tested, and much higher prevalence if you have selective sampling, weekends or nights, for example. Much higher prevalence if you sample outside a nightclub on a Friday night. If you look at on suspicion studies, again, both for drugs and alcohol, you find much higher rates, something like 80% for drugs, 90% for alcohol, maximum. If you look at studies of serious injured drivers, you find any psychoactive substance somewhere between 10 and 53% of cases, and alcohol-drug combinations in something from about 0.5 to 10%. In most studies, cannabis is the most detected illicit drug. And if we look at studies of killed drivers, you find somewhere between 26 and 57% positive for any substance, but big differences when it comes to drugs across countries and areas. In Druid, benzodiazepines and then amphetamines were the most important substances, but a number of studies, cannabis has been most detected, one very high rates recently from the UK. And in a significant number of studies, and again echoing its importance, you see that in many studies you see quite high rates of both drugs and alcohol reported in fatality cases. Well, that's sort of trying to very quickly run through a lot of data, and I'll say something a little bit subjective about some of the new challenges we're seeing, I think, perhaps in this area, or things we might need to think about for the future. We've seen big changes in what's happened in cannabis in the EU. We used to be a predominantly resin consuming area, cannabis imported from Morocco. What we've seen in the last 10 years is a massive increase in domestic production. We're seeing a lot of innovation in this area. We're seeing very, very high strains of domestic cannabis. And we're also now seeing that happening in the resin. We've seen the Moroccan producers actually increasing changing the kinds of seeds they're using, and resin potency increasing. Some of the material we've seen seized, not typically, but atypically, has been extremely high. We had the French report recently, a resin with over 60% prevalence. I thought it was nonsense. We checked the data and it seemed to be true. So cannabis is becoming a different sort of substance out there. The other thing we're very concerned about in Europe, and it's become quite an important issue in some of our countries, especially in Eastern Europe, is the emergence of new psychoactive substances. Now, an issue you're very familiar with in New Zealand. And again, what we're seeing is an increasing number of new substances reported. Last year, we had 81 new psychoactive substances reported to the EU's early warning system. This year, we're monitoring now over 400, and this year is going to be an increase on that last year's total. Don't know what the final total will be, but we're not seeing any let-up in the new substances appearing in the market. In some countries, they've become quite important. There's very little information on what these might mean in terms of impaired driving. But we have some very limited data. Interestingly, one recent Finnish study found that 6% of drivers stopped under suspicion were positive for a catanone, MDVP. Okay, I think I can just about get there. I'm running through this. The other thing coming in the back of this issue is what we've seen, the emergence of some extremely high potency substances, and this has really been a game changer in terms of law enforcement. You have substances that are active at the microgram level. This is just a graphic showing how much volume of a substance do you need to make 10,000 doses. And so we've seen the emergence of synthetic hallucinogens and synthetic opiate drugs that are highly active, very difficult to detect for law enforcement. They're causing lots of public health concerns in terms of overdose risk, but they're also very, very difficult to detect in biological samples. So we're missing overdose deaths in this area, we know, and I suspect this can also be an issue for drugs and driving studies. And then again, on the back of the NPS, we're also seeing the emergence of lots of what were basically called, I suppose, lifestyle products or herbal remedies or training aids, which are psychoactive. They're purchased on sites like Amazon. Here's an example of 3 of them. They're all psychoactive, and we know nothing about their prevalence. We know nothing about what they might mean in terms of impairment. So that's my running up. And just in terms now of summing up, what do we know? Well, I think it's clear from the Druid study, at least, the main concluding was that alcohol should remain focus number 1. And the cost-effectiveness study suggested that anything you did on drugs and driving that removed resources from the alcohol area was likely to be bad news. So I think very importantly that we recognise the fact that we complement our alcohol work, we don't detract from it. Combinations of alcohol and drugs and medicines also seem to be quite important, but are much more, as it's already noted today, politically hot potato. But certainly Druid suggested there was a lot you could do in education, training for professionals, labelling that could make a big difference here, and we simply aren't doing it in Europe at the moment. The problems of medicine use among drivers needs to be addressed. So combinations of alcohol and drugs, and combinations are clearly important. Again, that's what we've already heard, I think, from the echoing all the presentations this morning, much more difficult to deal with from a sort of enforcement position. From assessing impairment becomes much more complicated when you're talking about drug combinations and interactions. Illicit drugs and driving important, but I think from certainly the European work, we see it's an issue for all our countries. But I think we would be wrong to say that the data's consistent. We see a lot of national variation, and we see some inconsistent results, particularly between the experimental and the epidemiological literature, drugs like amphetamines and THC, for example. And then on terms of stimulants, a background issue that it might not be the drug use on board, it might be the sleep deprivation that's the important issue, and how do we respond to that? Because in fact, it's occurring after the consumption of the substance. the data is not, international data is not terribly comparable in this area. One of the things that I think have come out of the discussions going around from the first meeting was the Tallery's work on establishing common research guidelines. I think they need to be updated now, so that's something I think perhaps we can take forward from this meeting. And finally, as a last thought, and I think this has already been, Rita made this point in the beginning, the fear of detecting is only one of the reasons people don't drink and drive. We've been extremely successful with young people in Europe, I think, who now don't drink and drive because they regard it as morally reprehensible. It's not because necessarily, or only partly because of fear of detection. The question is, how do we encourage the same attitudes to drug use and driving? And I think that, to me, that's probably the number one question. And I suggest, to achieve this, it may be important that the evidence is seen to be sound and policies are viewed as rational, fair and proportional to risk. And for that reason, I think meetings like this and bringing the evidence and the policy together is so important. And I leave you with a little bit of advertising material. Thank you very much.